Over the past several years, as Russia has continued their war against Ukraine, there has been a lot of talk about how Russia is supposedly defeating Ukraine on the battlefield, wearing Ukraine down over time, and taking strategic objectives from Ukraine at a level that Ukraine cannot sustain. And this is, of course, untrue. And what a lot of people don't realize is that of all the major Ukrainian defeats over the past couple of years, the major defeats have always come for exactly one reason, a reason that appears to now have been finally addressed. And that reason is the discontinuation of critical aid at exactly the moment when Ukraine needed it the most. Two instances stick out in particular, the first being the Battle of Avdiivka, where Ukraine was holding this strategic position against Russia for a very long time and inflicting severe losses against the Russians, only to eventually, unfortunately, run out of ammunition, in particular, run out of artillery shells to the point where they could not sustain that position. And the reason that Ukraine ran out of ammunition in this case was because the Congress back in the United States was in a deadlock about whether or not they should supply aid to Ukraine. And even though they did eventually resume that aid to Ukraine, the pause in aid, even if momentarily, gave Russia an advantage on the battlefield and let them have one of their most significant conquests of the entire war. Another situation that sticks out is similar, with Ukraine's push into Russia taking a portion of Russia's Kursk region from the Russian military rather quickly and then holding on to it extremely strongly, until almost overnight the Ukrainians seem to have decided to kind of pull their troops back from that region for the most part, only maintaining a small foothold. And the reason that Ukraine lost that position was similar to the first, where because the United States made a short-term decision to pause intelligence sharing with Ukraine, Ukraine was unable to maintain their positions to the level that they had been, and in that short window of time, the Russians were able to take advantage of that tactical disadvantage that Ukraine had and was able to push forward. Russia is really not excelling at their war against Ukraine. There is a reason that Russia's primary battlefield tactic seems to be to work as hard as they can to reduce the aid that Ukraine is receiving from their partners, particularly from the United States. And yet, while the world has struggled with this and been frustrated by this for so many years, it seems that this might finally be coming to an end, with Ukraine finally having consistent long-term access to the tools they need, where it seems like it is unlikely that the United States will remove access to those weapons again. Now, if you haven't figured it out yet, what I am talking about in this case is Donald Trump's recent decision to sort of switch gears on the war in Ukraine and start actually taking an active stance against Russia, and to, for the first time, begin allocating more weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And it is not just the mere fact that this is happening, but it is details surrounding how it has happened that make me rather confident that these weapons deliveries will actually continue over the long term. Because Trump is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. Trump is doing this out of something that, for him, is a much more stable foundation. Trump is doing this out of what appears to be political necessity, and he has found a way to do it that will allow him to satisfy his own base, that he is not costing the United States anything, with him finally getting a contract basically with NATO nations to allow them to purchase American weapons on behalf of Ukraine and send them to the Ukrainians. A lot of people have pointed at this move from Trump, and they have commented on how it is underwhelming, and I actually agree with that. It is underwhelming in the sense that the United States, if they chose to, could do a lot more. And if their goal was actually to help protect Ukrainian lives and defeat Russia more quickly, they could take much more significant steps. However, what a lot of people are missing is that despite the fact that the United States support right now is underwhelming, it is still incredibly significant. Because what it does is it addresses, again, the only reason that Ukraine has struggled on occasions during their war against Russia, which is a lack of access to their most important supplies. And in particular, a lack of access often to the supplies and assistance that only the United States can provide. What is incredibly significant about this most recent move is that unlike previous aid that the United States has provided to Ukraine, the United States has now put itself in a position where there will be absolutely no political justification if it decides to pause that aid again. And recall that while the United States has already paused aid a couple of times to Ukraine, each time they have basically been forced to reverse that decision extremely quickly, I think largely because of massive political backlash back at home. And in all of these pauses, the justifications that have been used will not work in this case. The main reason the United States would no longer be able to justify pausing aid to Ukraine again is primarily because it is no longer aid. The United States is now being paid for the weapons that it provides to Ukraine, either from European partners or from Ukraine itself. And so all of the people acting like the United States is getting ripped off by helping Ukraine simply have no argument to stand on. They have no legs to stand on, and they will be quickly laughed out of the door and hopefully very quickly shut down. And the second reason that the United States could no longer justify pausing aid to Ukraine is because we have finally now reached a point where major representatives from both political parties have been willing to admit that the war is Russia's fault and that Russia is not willing to end their war against Ukraine, and finally removing the lie that Ukraine is sort of in the wrong for wanting to defend itself. These arguments have been used in the past, and the people who have used them have found them to not be expedient at all, and they have found that the political backlash is too much. So now that they themselves have sort of admitted that Ukraine's cause is just and have used that admission to provide aid to Ukraine, it would be even harder for them to make that decision in the future. And again, they have quickly reversed that decision in the past because of backlash. It seems unlikely that they are going to do that again. So these are the reasons that I believe the provision of U.S. weapons to Ukraine is secure for the long term. And with that in mind, we can now analyze how big of a deal that actually is. And it turns out it's a very big deal. I've already mentioned that Ukraine's only major losses up to this point have been due to a lack of U.S. provided supplies that we could have provided them. And so with the U.S. now somewhat committed to providing Ukraine at least the unique tools that only the U.S. can provide, it puts Ukraine in an incredibly good position, and it makes it almost impossible for Russia to win. Let me explain why. When it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine, almost all of the experts have defined this as a war of attrition, most similar historically to World War I, where when we look at a map of the Russia and Ukraine conflict, we see basically locked-in battle lines that hardly move from day to day, month to month, and even year to year. Yes, sometimes Russia will make gains on Ukrainian territory, but they do not make gains on Ukrainian territory in the sense of leading to a dramatic breakthrough moment, but rather what we see is Russia committing a whole lot of soldiers to overwhelm a particular Ukrainian position, at which point the Ukrainians will abandon that position but move back just slightly to a new line where they can hold more strongly and more securely. This war, therefore, is not being decided by small gains in land over the short term, but rather by which military can field the most soldiers and the most resources over the long term. World War I ended in a similar way, where the battle lines were largely locked in for almost the entire conflict. But eventually the economy of Germany was so worn down because of the cost of the war, but also because of blockades and other things, that they could no longer support the front line. And when they could no longer support the front line, that was finally when they realized they could quickly be overrun and they were basically forced to surrender. And most people, both on the Russian and the Ukrainian side, agree that this is sort of the strategic scenario of the war. The Russians simply believe that they can outlast the Ukrainians, while the Ukrainians, on the other hand, believe they can outlast the Russians. Now, the reason the Russians believe they can outlast the Ukrainians is because, by raw numbers, Russia is a larger country than Ukraine, just by size of territory, therefore by size of resources, also by size of raw population. And the reason the Ukrainians think they can outlast the Russians is because the Ukrainians are not standing alone. They have a whole lot of partners that are getting behind them. And because of this, there has been a big strategy by Russia to help them win their war of attrition, to do everything they can in both Europe and in the United States to spread lies, literally just to spread propaganda to try to convince these nations to give less support to Ukraine. If Ukraine does not receive aid from its partners, it will likely succumb to Russia eventually. Although they will still continue to fight incredibly hard, they would probably be overwhelmed if they didn't have support from their partners. But if Ukraine does receive supplies from their partners, they will definitely defeat Russia. And we have reached the point where Europe, after many years of waiting, has finally decided to invest massive budgets in remilitarization. But on its own, Europe is not enough to easily defeat Russia. Because while Europe might have a lot of vigor and a lot of enthusiasm about investing in Ukraine's war effort, Europe doesn't yet, in the short term, have the military capacity to actually turn all of that cash into actual weapons systems that Ukraine can use. And even more than that, even though Europe can provide a lot of aid to Ukraine, they can't provide on their own some of the most critical aid to Ukraine because Europe doesn't possess the weapons systems that Ukraine needs. The United States is the one who provides those. And so what we are now realizing when we understand this entire strategic scenario is that Ukraine is finally, for the first time in the war, right now in a place where all of the chips they need are finally stacked on their side of the table. Europe has committed huge financial resources, which they can use to purchase weapons from the United States to fill the gaps in what Europe can't produce. The United States seems to be in a position where they are somewhat committed to continuing providing that support to Ukraine, even if it's not all the support they can provide. It is the bare minimum support that they basically have to provide to fill the gaps that only they can fill. And this means that as long as these things remain true, however long the war in Ukraine goes, Ukraine is now in a position where they essentially have guaranteed victory conditions. The big piece of all of this that could, of course, change is Donald Trump. As we know, he came into this war not really having the position he currently has today. He's flip-flopped several times, and it's not inconceivable that he could flip-flop again, although it does seem a little bit unlikely now that he has finally reached this point. I do feel pretty good about this currently, though, because it seems that Europe and Ukraine have finally caught on to how to kind of manage Donald Trump, which is basically to flatter him and give him money. Europe is buying the weapons from the United States, so again, Donald Trump's main argument against providing them has been disarmed. The main thing he always cares about is money. That has been what has guided and characterized most of his attitude towards the war in Ukraine. That's something I've examined in depth in other videos. Even when it came to initial pauses in aid to Ukraine, that always seemed like a bargaining chip for Trump to negotiate other deals that he had going on with Ukraine at the time, in particular the minerals deal, and then even the recent pause seemed like a bargaining chip to try to get other nations to pony up and spend more money to buy U.S. weapons systems. Seems like Donald Trump finally has what he wants, and the main thing that motivates him. And it also seems like Ukraine is finally managing Donald Trump really well. Kind of speaking in Donald Trump language, saying that every call with Donald Trump was the best call yet, and kind of giving Donald Trump credit for all the good things that happen. Now, while that might be hard for some people to swallow, especially based on the fact that this took 6 months when it could have been done on day one, as long as it keeps the aid coming to Ukraine, that is what will allow them to win their war. And so the best way to kind of manage this chip is not to continue kind of criticizing Donald Trump for the things that happened in the past, but rather to try to encourage Donald Trump with really positive feedback on this most recent move. Donald Trump very clearly responds to polls. He very clearly responds to when people are upset and also when people are really happy about something. And so if people kind of respond to Donald Trump giving aid to Ukraine, there's even a chance that things could progress even further. And that would, of course, be even better for Ukraine. They could progress in better deals as far as weapons going to Ukraine. They could progress in the United States providing even additional weapon systems to Ukraine or additional permissions to use those weapon systems on additional targets. Donald Trump has already asked Ukraine if they have the ability to strike Moscow and St. Petersburg. And there seems to be kind of a lot behind that question that could imply maybe a willingness for him to provide further support to Ukraine if this move is well received and gives him the most important thing to Donald Trump, which is good headlines and good feedback. And so, while there is still a wild card here, the wild card seems to be well controlled, and the people who are most in charge of managing that wild card seem to have finally picked up on how to actually do that. So all in all, my perspective right now is that as far as Ukraine goes, things are rather encouraging. Maybe the most encouraging they have ever been. And if you have any questions about that analysis, or maybe you disagree with that analysis because it differs from a lot of what you might be hearing in, for example, the mainstream news, I should point out that this is not the first time that I've given an assessment like this on Donald Trump and his motivations, and not the first time that I have been correct when a lot of people were wrong. Both times that Donald Trump paused aid to Ukraine, I gave a similar analysis where I said he's not abandoning Ukraine. He's not doing the right thing, but he's not abandoning Ukraine. He's just trying to get more money out of them in exchange for U.S. support. I think that's exactly what's going on here, and I think he's now gotten that. And I think that is probably the most predictive thing about Trump's future behavior and his future decisions and other considerations around that. So if you appreciate that independent analysis, actually one of the reasons I'm able to do that is because I don't belong to a newspaper. I don't belong to another organization or anything like that I feel is kind of telling me what to think or kind of forcing me to stick to a particular narrative. Instead, I am funded to a large degree by my community and by viewers like you who only fund me if I'm actually doing a good job, if I'm telling the truth, if my predictions are proving to be accurate based on all of the available data and things like that. So if you appreciated this video and you want to help support this channel and future videos like this, you can do so actually by becoming a patron. It's completely voluntary, just for people who want a way to support the channel to do so. To learn more about that, just scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video. That said, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.